let's begin with how we got here today. You were to receive a humanitarian award from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. That award was rescinded before being reinstated. But when it was rescinded, the people of Birmingham, Alabama, immediately responded.
You know, I have never loved Birmingham as much as I love Birmingham at this moment.
But I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about that process, and in particular, what we learn, both about history but also about the present, by virtue of what happened.
You know, I didn't have a chance to get mic'd like you,
Oh,
Imani,
okay.
because I wanted to see everything that happened before I came on.
Yes.
So, and it is really a joy to be here this evening. I want to thank everyone for coming out. People in Birmingham, from Alabama, and I know my friends and comrades are here from New York and Chicago and Oakland and all over the country. So thank all of you for being here this evening. It almost feels as if we're marking a new beginning.
Yes.
And what I can say is that, of course, when I learned that I was to receive the Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award from the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, I was overcome with joy. Reverend Shuttlesworth has always been one of my heroes, and I have always admired those, especially Odessa Woolfolk.
Yes.
Who had the vision that led to the creation of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And so I want to say from the very beginning that I don't want to do anything that can damage the future of this very important institution in our community. But I was surprised to hear that later they decided to rescind the award. And then when I discovered that it might have something to do with my involvement over many years in efforts to advocate for justice for Palestine, it became clear to me that this might actually be a teachable moment.
Yes.
That as much as the whole controversy might have, at least for the moment, damaged the reputation of those who made that decision, that we might seize this moment to reflect on what it means to live on this planet in the 21st century and our responsibilities not only to people in our immediate community, but to people all over the planet.
Yes.
And of course, in occupied Palestine, Black people especially owe a great deal to Palestinians who have been struggling for decades and decades and refuse to give up. They are an inspiration to people who are fighting for freedom everywhere on the planet.
Yeah.
So did I answer your question, Imani?
Yes, and relatedly though, because I think that there is a misperception that is fairly widespread in this moment that is important for us to talk about, that solidarity with Palestinian people does not mean one is anti-Semitic or does not also have solidarity with Jewish people, right? And yesterday, I think it was yesterday, there was a national solidarity Shabbat for you, right? And for those who aren't aware, Shabbat is the Sabbath ritual for Jewish people, right? And one of the things that they said as part of the solidarity Shabbat, right, is Angela, you are welcome at this Shabbat. Can you tell us about the significance of that, both the phrase itself, but also for you as a person who has been engaged in struggles for justice that are international for the majority of your life?
Well, first of all, I know that Jewish Voice for Peace has done an incredible job, not only at this particular moment, but in general, creating a very powerful movement among Jewish people.
Yes.
I was, by the way, just speaking at Brandeis last week. I went to Brandeis University, which was founded in the same year as the State of Israel. And I often point out that I learned about Palestine at a Jewish university.
Right.
And so Jewish Voice for Peace has done an amazing job over the last years, bringing people together, all over the country. So when I heard about this Shabbat, I said, well, first of all, it made me feel really humble, because I don't really think of myself as being special. Now, hold on for a second. Let me say what I have to say. I think that a lot of work that has been accomplished by organizations and movements and huge numbers of people gets projected onto individuals.
Okay.
I know we often assume that when we speak of the civil rights movement, immediately, who comes to mind?
Right. Okay.
Dr. King. And of course, Dr. King was a powerful figure, but he did not create the civil rights movement.
Right.
And I think particularly at this moment in our history, when we are so influenced by the neoliberal ideologies of global capitalism, we have to figure out ways in which we can contest this individualism.
That's right. Yeah.
That shapes the way we think about the world.
Yes.
So what I want to say is that I'm happy to be here. But I think it's important that you know that I am simply standing in for the work that was done by vast numbers of people, thousands and millions of people all over the country and all over the world. And so that is how I read the Shabbat.
Okay.
And the slogan, Angela, sister, you are welcome in this house. Angela, sister, you are welcome in this Shabbat, comes from a slogan that was used on many posters all over the country when I was underground, fleeing the FBI. So people put up these posters on their doors, Angela, sister, you are welcome in this house. And you have to realize that the only reason people are familiar with my name and my history today is because people did that work of organizing the movement to save my life back in the 1970. Well, it started in 1969 when Ronald Reagan fired me from my job. But, I don't know why I always end up in the middle of these situations. I really never asked to be at the center of it all. I was very happy to be organizing on the sidelines and doing the work to promote someone else, but somehow or another, I have no idea.
Why at the center?
I have no idea why. And even now, at age 75, here I am again. But I can tell you that what I've always tried to do is to utilize the moment, to take advantage of the particular arena. And I think we're doing this here this evening. I was scheduled to be here on February 16th, and what is this date?
February 16th.
And here I am.
Yes.
Not because of anything I myself did, but because of the amazing organizing work of the Birmingham Committee for Truth and Reconciliation.
Yeah.
So thank all of you who were involved in organizing this event this evening.
So I want to go back to 1970, but also beforehand, because one of the things that I think is often missed about Birmingham in particular is that there is this long, robust Black radical tradition that comes out of Birmingham. And so I'm interested in, having you talk some about the root of your radicalism here. And then also, how it is, you have these sort of two pieces of your journey, which are actually, I think, a big piece of why you wind up at the center of all these things, that you're an intellectual and an organizer, right? So how did that come to be?
Of course, Imani is asking me the question, but she's an amazing researcher and has done, I love your book on Lorraine Hansberry.
Oh, thank you.
And she probably knows the answer better than I, but I can try. The roots of our radicalisms.
Yeah.
I grew up in the city. And as difficult as people from the outside may have thought living in Birmingham, Alabama was, it was actually an amazing experience. And I know a bunch of my childhood friends are here this evening.
I see.
I know Madeline Core, Houston Brown, I saw Bugs, and I saw a bunch of people. There you all are. So, thinking about growing up in Birmingham, I realized that actually we learned how to resist.
Yeah.
And there's a story I often tell about the games that we used to play as children. My house was, the house still stands there on Center Street and 11th Court. And those of you who know the history of Birmingham, you know that Center Street divided the Black neighborhood from the area that was zoned for white people.
Right.
And you know about the bombs that happened on the other side of Center Street. But also as kids, we used to dare each other to run across the street. Knowing full well that what we were doing was illegal.
Right. Yeah.
And there were some white people who lived across the street from our house. I think they were the Montees. And so we used to dare each other to run across the street and run up on their porch and ring their doorbell and make it back to safety before anyone came to the door. And it was fun. And so one of the things that I learned growing up in Birmingham is that resistance can be fun.
That's a big piece of it, yeah.
It can bring us pleasure and joy.
Yes. When did you know you were going to become a scholar? At what point did that calling emerge for you?
Well, I have to think about that because initially I thought I was going to be a doctor. I used to go to Children's Home Hospital. Anybody remember that? It was a children's hospital down on 8th Avenue. And Jasper Road, that's right. Thank you, Houston. So I love that place. And I originally had decided that I was going to be a doctor. And as a matter of fact, I got accepted at Fisk on an early admission program. I think I was 15. And so I figured, okay, if I go to Fisk, I will graduate when I'm 19, and then I'll go to Meharry. I'll just go right across the street to Meharry Medical School. Then I'll be a doctor by the time I'm 20-something. And so I had it all planned out in my head. But then it was my father. I love Fisk, don't get me wrong. And I know that Claudia Burnham is here, my friend from growing up in Birmingham and from New York, and she went to Fisk. But at the same time, I had the opportunity to go to New York for my last 2 years of high school. So I chose to go to New York. And I think it was probably that decision that exposed me to ideas that I had never imagined before. I was fortunate to, I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and I go to this high school where we read the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, and where we read Freud in high school.
It was informally known as the Little Red Schoolhouse.
Well,
or was
no,
that
actually,
the
whole system is the Little Red Schoolhouse, and the elementary school and the high school. The high school, it was Elizabeth Irwin founded Little Red Schoolhouse during the 30s, when there were a lot of progressive, experimental schools happening, but then during the McCarthy era, they disassociated the school from the public school system.
I see,
And the teachers who were also, whitelisted? The teachers decided to cooperatively own and control the school. So they could teach whatever they wanted.
So that's what exposed you to, moved you.
Well, I had to learn French. And I often point out I had to do 3 years of French in 1 year so that I could catch up with my class by the time we graduated.
Wow.
And learning French also exposed me to French culture and philosophy, and I was, moved by existentialism in those days. This was the period of the beatniks in New York, and it was an amazing era. It was an amazing era.
And then you studied with Marcuse.
I studied with Herbert Marcuse at Brandeis.
What was that? Was that another sort of watershed for you intellectually?
Oh, absolutely. For some reason, I think I knew that that a connection with Marcuse would be transformative. I told you I was at Brandeis 2 weeks ago, and somebody asked me, well, why did Marcuse choose you? And I said, I don't know. I don't know whether he chose me. I think I can be persistent sometimes. And I think after I told him so much about my desire to learn philosophy, by this time I'm in my senior year, and I've already spent a year in Paris, and I was majoring in French, but I decided that I wanted to shift to philosophy. Mm-hmm. And I told him how passionate I was about philosophy. But the problem is, I've never taken a single philosophy course. And so he said, okay, let's change that. And so during the first semester of my senior year, he did this intensive history of philosophy, independent study with me. So I met with him a couple of times a week, and wow. I had to read everything from the pre-Socratics, all the way up, Plato, Aristotle, Spinoza, the whole history of Western philosophy, wow. Up to Immanuel Kant. And he told me, I'm doing a graduate seminar on Kant's critique of pure reason next semester. Mm-hmm. So I want you to take that seminar. And I was scared to death. I mean, I'm in a seminar with advanced graduate students, and he forced me to give the first paper. So those of you who are academics, you know what that means.
Yes. Okay.
And after that, I was really hooked.
Yeah.
I think I don't think I could have imagined any other trajectory for myself. Mm. But what I haven't said was why I was drawn to critical theory and Herbert Marcuse, because it wasn't philosophy per se. It was philosophy in the service of social, political, economic transformation. Right. It was critical theory. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And later on, after I had studied critical theory for many, many years, I had this, the French would call it prise de conscience. I had this moment when I realized why I felt so drawn to critical theory. Because critical theory urges us to question that which exists, and it conveys the message that just because something exists does not mean that it will exist in the future. Mm-hmm. Does not mean that it cannot become something else.
Yes.
And then I remember growing up as a child here in Birmingham when my mother would always tell us when we wanted to know, why can't we go to the amusement park? Why can't we go to the big library? Mm-hmm. Right? And she always was very careful about saying that, this is segregation. Mm-hmm. This is the way things are now. Mm-hmm. But she always said, this is not the way they always have to be. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of learned from my mother how to both live in the existing world and at the same time inhabit an imaginary. Mm-hmm. How can I imagine Birmingham of the future? So I was always thinking about change. Yes. And I think that was also what drew me to critical theory.
Mm-hmm. Over the last 2 weeks, my students have been reading Women, Race, and Class. one of your classic texts, and one of the things that we've talked about in the course is what it means to construct a history, right? To tell a story in a particular way with the goals, the transformative goals of critical theory in mind. And in the context of the discussion, one of the things I've talked to them about is your work around prisons and prison abolitionism, right? And prison abolition as a value that began decades before there's a public conversation about mass incarceration. And that seems to be something that often you are engaged have been engaged in the kind of organizing that later people begin to catch on to, but is controversial, to say the least. So, I'm okay. So can we talk a little bit about prisons and the connection between this work? You're one of the founders of Critical Resistance, right? Around the same time that Women, Race, and Class is published, right? Or a couple of years after the publication. Yeah.
Imani, you're very young.
Okay.
It was like something like maybe 20 years before.
20 years before?
Yeah.
Okay.
But
well,
yeah, time. Okay.
Yeah.
You asked me a lot of questions, and I love those rich,
I want to get a
complex
sense of
questions.
what.
But first of all, you mentioned my book, Women, Race, and Class, which was published in 1981.
Okay.
Okay, Critical Resistance, the conference happened in 1998.
I thought the organization had started in the 80s. I was wrong. Okay.
Well, yeah. So we started the organizing in 1997.
Okay.
I think 1996.
Okay.
But the impetus for writing this book, which is called Women, Race, and Class, actually came from the period I was in jail. I wrote an article when I was in jail entitled "The Role of Black Women in the Community of Slaves." That was published by the Black Scholar, and I wrote that article because of all of the very confusing conversation that was happening at the time about Black women being responsible for the oppression of Black communities. It was around the time that the Moynihan Report came out in 1965, right? So there were all of these ideas that were circulating, including among prison intellectuals, including George Jackson, for example. So I had a number of arguments with George Jackson about the role of women in the movement. There was a tendency to assume that the problem with the problems we were experiencing in Black communities had to do with this is the way they put it. It was the white man and the Black woman. I don't know whether any of you remember. They used to say there are only two free people in the world. The white man and the Black woman. You remember that? Yeah. And so this whole notion of the matriarchal structure of the Black community. And so therefore, if there was going to be Black liberation, Black men had to overthrow the matriarchy. Yeah, things were...
That's a problem.
I mean, can you believe it? And so that was actually the impetus for beginning to do that research that eventually led to Women, Race, and Class. And I think that virtually all of the intellectual work I've done has responded to urgent questions, urgent contemporary questions. And I don't think that that's necessarily a way to shape one's trajectory as a scholar. But for me, my scholarship has always been very closely connected to transformative movements that can produce a different and better future.
Of course, yeah.
So that's why I wrote that book, and then now I'm losing.
Well, just just to ask a sort of follow-up question.
So what was that? What was the other question you asked? You asked me two questions.
I did, and I don't quite remember the second one either.
Doesn't remember.
But, no.
Okay, so it's not just the senior moment here.
But it's
prison.
About prison.
Right,
yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you.
And so, actually, abolition has a very long history. I think I first encountered the idea that we might consider abolishing rather than reforming prisons when I was in jail myself. In 1971, the Attica Rebellion took place, and the Attica brothers called for a whole range of really, radical transformations. Among them was the abolition of the prison system as we know it.
Yes.
And at the same time, in Quaker circles, we've been talking about the connection between religion and struggle. The Quakers were the ones who invented the prison.
Right. Penitentiary, right?
The penitentiary.
Right.
Well, yeah, because it was assumed back in those days that this institution could rehabilitate individuals, that it could give people the opportunity to be penitent. So one went to prison in order to reflect on one's behavior and in order to establish a relationship with God. But, it sounded great. But the practice of the prison involved repression and the worst kind of physical, corporal punishment. So the Quakers, who literally invented the prison as punishment, also offered abolition to us as a goal once they realized that this institution does not work. It's creating more violence than it is erasing. And so, I became aware that we might think differently because, prison reform rolls off of everybody's tongues. Really easily, right?
Yeah.
You talk about prison, you want to do something about it, what do? You reform. But the whole history of the prison is a history of reform. It's been reformed over and over and over and over again. And the more it is reformed, the more repressive it becomes, and the more permanent it becomes. And I say this because we're at a moment now when everybody's talking about mass incarceration, right? So what are they offering? Criminal justice reform, yes. And so there is the possibility that if we don't change the nature of the discourse around the prison, that we'll end up in the end with an institution that is even more repressive and even more permanent than when we began. So yes.
Now, one of the things I think both. So these ideas and this message you've been engaged in for decades, but you're also consistently in conversation with younger organizers, right? People who are emerging, young people in Ferguson, right? And on campuses, one of the students who's in my class said he signed up for my class because you had come to his high school, right? In Northampton, Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah, I love speaking in high schools.
Yeah.
I do. And once I was invited to speak in an elementary school, and I said, I don't think I was ever so nervous.
The babies are a tough crowd. You have to keep them engaged.
And I had to tell the students, I said, this is the first time I've ever done this, so, you have to let me know if I'm doing okay. And because I'm used to talking to graduate students. So so as the talk unfolded, I would ask them, am I doing okay? Is this all right? And so yeah. Now I can say I also love teaching, speaking at elementary schools.
Too. But what's the motivation for you? I think I have an idea, but for constantly, and also, what do you see that's happening now that's hopeful? People tend to be very critical of millennials, especially young millennials. But what do you see in them in terms of this, struggle, movement, organizing?
Well, change has always come from the younger generations.
Yeah.
And it's very bizarre that as we grow older, we forget, and somehow we think that we are the ones in possession of all of the knowledge. And we forget what it was like to be young and to respect our elders, but also recognize that sometimes we have to do things differently, and that means we have to challenge our elders. You mentioned Ferguson. Ferguson was an amazing moment, a conjuncture in the history of this country that marked the beginning of something very new.
Yes.
And the fact that they decided to do something a bit different from what we had been doing for years and decades. Because we've been challenging racist police violence ever since the days of slavery.
Right.
That has been the one constant theme of the struggle for black liberation. Mm-hmm. Am I right?
Yes, that's right.
And more recently, we've gotten into the habit, this individualism that's associated with the capitalism that we were talking about before. Yes. We've gotten into the habit of assuming that the problem somehow lies with the individual who perpetrated the violence. And so, you call for the prosecution of the individual police officer. But we all know that it's not about individuals. We all know that racism is embedded in the very apparatus of policing. And so that also means, speaking about abolition, that we have to think about something very different, and perhaps also the abolition of policing as we know it.
Right.
And so young people in Ferguson refused to give up. They kept going back. And let's also remember that Ferguson marked a moment when the black struggle in this country became internationalized once more.
Again, right.
And this was also largely due to the work of Palestinian resistors on the ground in occupied Palestine, who were the first to offer solidarity to those who were protesting in Ferguson. Let's not forget that.
Yes.
And we also learn, thanks to Ferguson and the organizing around it and all of the conversations that occurred as a result of Ferguson, that rather than simply calling for the prosecution of individual police officers, we had to address such things as the militarization of the police. And we learned that small police force in Ferguson, Missouri, had been in part trained by the Israeli army. Yes. And so that means that if we want to struggle against racism, if we want to do a good job of doing this work in our communities right now, we have to be aware of the international reverberations and international connections and intersections.
Yes.
And so I think we, young people, are the ones who developed this new framework.
Yeah.
This didn't come from, old civil rights veterans, as we're often called.
It's better.
And I think that the reason I feel connected with what has unfolded over the last period is because I've been willing to learn from my young sisters and brothers and comrades. I've recognized that they are the vanguard. They are out front. They are the ones who are showing us the way. And I often point out that the metaphor we use of one generation standing on the shoulders of the previous generation, we should think about that. Because if you're standing on someone's shoulders, it means, first of all, you've learned pretty much all that they've learned, right? You know what they know. But you're on their shoulders, and you can see a great deal further. So this is why I think it's so important to accept the leadership of young people.
Yeah. You've talked some about capitalism, individualism, imperialism, settler colonialism, racism, right? So there's an underlying politic, right, that makes me think that you're talking about in terms of solidarity with other people, and it makes me think of the phrase we use colloquially, right? Who are your people? And I'm interested in now, right, in this landscape, right, across the borders of nation and the way we categorize identity. How would you name who the freedom fighters are? And I'm asking that because I'm hoping in particular that it helps give people a language, for thinking about a sense of belonging that isn't tied up in neoliberalism and nationalism and, clannishness. And
my people are all of those people who are struggling for justice and freedom in the world. And, let me say something about, I know we only have a few minutes left. I saw a sign a little while ago that said 5 minutes.
Yes.
But first of all, the reason Black people have been so central to the history of this part of the world is because Black people have engaged in an incredible struggle that's 5 centuries old, for like 500 years. You know, since the first slave rebellions that took place with the assistance of indigenous people, of Native Americans, and the whole history of black people in this part of the world cannot be told without also considering the history of the indigenous inhabitants.
Yes.
We wouldn't be where we are today. But the fact that black people have been struggling generation after generation after generation, you know, you would think that by now people would have given up. Some people have. Some people have decided, oh, I may as well just assimilate. But in their vast majority, black people have refused to give up that struggle from 500 years ago to the present moment. And that is incredible. That is remarkable. As a matter of fact, if there's any hope for democracy in this country, that hope comes from the black, and it's always come from the Black Liberation Movement.
Yeah.
And at this moment, we have, there's somebody who lives at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue who is trying to throw a wrench into, the whole trajectory right now. And so I would say, my people are people who recognize that the nation state is not the most appropriate form of human communities. And when people decide that they want to take their future in their hands and they travel in search of a better life, and they try to travel to the United States because there's no other possibility open to them. And then when they're referred to, we're talking about women who are trying to escape femicide in Honduras and Guatemala, and when they are characterized as criminals. Yes, they are my people. They are my people. The Palestinians are my people.
Yes.
The Rohingya are my people. The Kurdish women who are standing up for revolution and for women's emancipation are my people. Trans activists who are showing us the way are my people. The LGBTQ community who understands that we need a revolutionary future, they are my people. And all of those who want to bring the system of capitalism to its knees, they are my people.
So, time's up. I apologize, I've taken it, but I just want to say...
We just got started, didn't we?
I want to say something briefly and then give you an opportunity to give a closing remark. And, one of the things that you started with was saying that you don't like to sort of focus on the individual and see yourself as a representative of a large community of people who have been in a struggle for justice. And I just want to say that itself is extremely inspiring, moving, and impactful for me, and I know for many people, right? So that what it means to actually have models of people who are not drunk on attention, but instead identify every opportunity that they have to speak truth to power, to share ideas as in community with other people in the world is it's incredibly important, particularly in this landscape, right? So thank you so much for that. Thank you. Do you have final words you want to share with your people? Yes, we love you. We love you.
I love Birmingham. I really love Birmingham. Yeah, you know, we were talking earlier. This is about the 5th time that I've done some kind of presentation today, so I can't remember exactly where it was. But we were talking about the fact that, you know, oftentimes we assume that when we work for justice and equality and freedom, that we're going to see immediate results. And capitalism teaches us to want to see, you know, the immediate, well, profit is what the capitalists, so we have a relationship to our history that is very much modeled after the capitalist market. And we don't necessarily recognize that the work we do today, while we may not see immediate consequences tomorrow or even next year or even 10 years from now, but maybe down the line, maybe 20 years or 50 years or 100 years from now, the work that we have done at this particular moment will have made a difference. And I think it's so important to try to develop that different temporality. And you know, I always point out that hundreds of years ago, there were people who were standing up against the institution of slavery, and they were imagining a different world. They knew that a different world was possible. They never got to experience that world. But that world is the world we are inhabiting today. They made it possible for us to be where we are. And so we have to begin to think broadly in that way and imagine how consequential our work can be. I was giving an example of the Me Too movement. Of course, black women never got the, credit for doing all of the really important work that demonstrates that misogynist violence, gender violence, is structural. It's not just about individuals. Right. So you can't just keep toppling individuals and assuming that because you tell them that they can't have this job anymore, that's changing the world. That is not changing the structure. It's like send people to prison and assume that you're dealing, with the problem for which they were sent to prison. So some people will remember 50 years ago beginning to do this work to end violence against women. A few people remember when Rosa Parks started to do it in 1944, before anyone else was doing investigations of rapes, right? Women, in Abbeville, Alabama. And so let's see if we can't gauge the value of the work we do now by its possible future consequences. And perhaps 50 years from now or 100 years from now, there will be some people gathered in the way we are gathered here this evening who will be thankful, who will give thanks to those who came before them, who will be thankful for the work we did when we were called upon to do it.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.